A person always has two reasons for doing anything, a good reason and a real reason. This phrase was said by John Pierpont, and he kept his real reason hidden from everyone. Look at his face. You've probably seen it more than once without realizing it. Where? I'll tell you later. He created the world's first and largest financial empire, saved the U.S. from ruin and bankruptcy several times, and amassed an unimaginable fortune, one that's impossible to calculate. He controlled the most profitable sectors of industry and finance: steel, weapons, railroads, and electricity. He came up with the Federal Reserve System, which prints dollars for the entire world. You could say that Morgan bought the U.S., but he also invested in the country, sponsoring its rise to power. Morgan was credited with power greater than the presidency and influence over global politics. He could afford anything, but he was desperately lonely and longed to overcome that loneliness. When he was dying, he didn't think about his wealth, power, or fame. He only thought about Sally West, the one thing that had truly touched his heart and made him genuinely happy long ago. Who was J.P. Morgan? How did he earn his unhappy billions, and what secret did he keep all his life? Let's figure it out together. Can you buy the whole world? Morgan's story suggests that, with effort, you can. But on April 17, 1837, when John Pierpont, or J.P. Morgan, was born in Hartford, Connecticut, he didn't know this yet. Morgan wasn't a poor country boy or a self-made genius who clawed his way up from nothing. No, he was born into a well-off family that was destined to become all-powerful, and J.P. Morgan did everything to make that happen. The Morgan family had deep roots in U.S. history. John's distant ancestors lived in Wales and Great Britain and were part of the aristocracy. His great-great-grandfather, Miles Morgan, was born in 1616 and inherited the title of Baron. That's the lowest rank in the aristocratic world, but in England, wealth and land had long been divided, making it hard to make big money from nothing. So, at 20, Miles Morgan boarded the ship Mary with his brothers and sailed to the British colonies in the New World. In Boston, he quickly set up a farm and even became the head of the town. His descendants confidently carved out their place in the world, opening shops and setting up businesses using stagecoaches. This French word literally translates to haste, but in the U.S., it referred to horse-drawn carriages that crisscrossed the country, linking the colonies of the 17th and 18th centuries, which would later become the United States. The stagecoach was the pre-railroad transportation that Morgan would later dive into during the 19th century. The Morgans also had strong ties in London's financial elite, and their family was connected with the Rothschilds. This European clan was just breaking into the American market at the time, and they needed a family to quietly channel their money without drawing attention. Remember this fact. John's grandfather, Joseph Morgan, owned a network of inns and controlled transportation in Connecticut, and he was known to be an extremely sociable man with a large number of influential friends. John's father, Junius Spencer Morgan, expanded beyond his home state, opening a banking house in New York and getting involved in insurance, which was highly profitable at the time. The Morgan team worked like a well-oiled machine, despite the lack of modern communication tools. Every morning, Junius would start a meeting in his office, where department heads and insurance agents gathered to discuss the day's plans, exchange information, and receive assignments. Junius always placed great importance on personal interaction, as it was essential to the smooth operation of the entire team. Junius was a strict father who was always busy with business, while John's mother, Juliet Pierpont, came from a very wealthy and noble family. One of her ancestors helped found Yale University, one of the top 3 most prestigious U.S. institutions, along with Harvard and Princeton. Yale is also part of the Ivy League, 8 elite schools where America's ruling and business elite are educated. Incidentally, another of her ancestors wrote the song that everyone hears during Christmas and New Year's. Jingle Bells. It was originally written for Thanksgiving, but it didn't catch on at the time. However, half a century later, it rose from the ashes and became the anthem of Christmas. Back to our hero. You can see his family was no ordinary one, but his childhood wasn't easy. Wealth doesn't equal health, and John Pierpont Morgan was a sickly child. Severe migraines, allergies, colds, and unpleasant vascular skin conditions plagued him. His nose was purple, veiny, and looked frightening. As an adult, J.P. Morgan hated photographers for this reason. The boy grew up in isolation, rarely playing with other children, and devoted all his time to home studies. His father took his son's education seriously and started teaching him the intricacies of business early on. The boy turned out to be a bright student, but the climate took a toll on young John Pierpont Morgan's health. He was sent to the Azores, where he spent the most carefree days of his life, enjoying the sea, sun, and walks that helped soothe his loneliness. When his health improved, his father sent him to study in Europe, Germany, and France. By age 19, he returned to the U.S. and got a job as a clerk in his father's bank, learning finance from the ground up. A year later, he met the love of his life. He fell madly in love and almost immediately proposed. At 20, he married Amelia Sturgis. The young woman was intelligent, charming, and equally in love with John. They made plans for the future, but Amelia was sick. She had tuberculosis. He tried to save his wife, sought out doctors, and sent her to resorts, all to no avail. At 24, John's wife died, and it shattered him. The grief of loneliness weighed so heavily on him that it seemed unbearable. J.P. Morgan threw himself into work, burying himself in business from morning till night. Money became his sole focus, a refuge from his painful thoughts. The growing pile of dollars seemed to fill the void in his life with some semblance of purpose. In 1861, Morgan opened his first company under the modest name J.P. Morgan & Co., dealing in currency speculation. It wasn't a noble business, often criticized, but profitable if one had persistence and talent. And John had those qualities. Over the next 20 years, the company would change its name several times as new business partners came on board. He would call it Dabney, Morgan & Co., then Drexel, Morgan & Co., until it finally became the famous J.P. Morgan. But that would come later. At this point, he's making money, a lot, but not astronomical sums. And then, U.S. history takes a sharp turn, one that Morgan fits into perfectly. In 1861, the American Civil War breaks out. The country splits into the northern United States and the southern Confederate States of America. The industrial North, controlled by Federalists, advocates for a stronger union of states and an expanded role for the central government. The North is also for the abolition of slavery, as it hinders the country's industrial progress. The southern states, primarily agricultural and reliant on slavery, push for a confederation where each state has more independence. The Civil War between the states and ideologies lasts 4 long years, and both sides need weapons. Morgan sees this opportunity and sells arms to both sides. One of his most famous deals was the sale of rifles. He bought 5,000 outdated rifles for $3.50 each, repaired them, and sold them to the northern states for $22 apiece. Not a bad profit, 600%. This deal netted Morgan $110,000, which in today's money equals around $2.2 million. At the time, J.P. Morgan was just 25, and by law, he should have served in the military, but Morgan had no interest in fighting. He wanted to make money. Back then, you could buy your way out of military service, pay $300, about $6,000 in today's money, and someone else would go in your place. Naturally, Morgan paid and continued profiting off the war. After the conflict, his dealings were even investigated in court, but nothing came of it. And since Morgan sold his expensive rifles to the winning North, he was even praised for his service to the nation. Morgan's fortune and influence began to grow. The Civil War ended in 1865, with the industrial North emerging victorious, triggering a massive industrial boom, particularly in the construction of railroads. There was no government monopoly or company in the U.S. to manage this. Construction was led by countless businessmen, each building their own sections of track where it suited them best. For comparison, in 1830, the U.S. had just one railroad stretching 21 kilometers from Baltimore to Ohio. By 1837, there were 2,000 kilometers of track, and by 1860, 48,000 kilometers. By 1916, the U.S. railroads would span 408,000 kilometers. The scale was enormous. Railroads quickly became the main way to transport goods and people, replacing the once popular stagecoaches. No wonder, trains could carry huge loads faster and more safely. Morgan saw where the real money was. In these years, he turned to railroads. But he didn't just become another builder of his own small railroad. That was too small and lonely a venture for him, and he feared loneliness. He wanted to surround himself with something bigger and set about building a national railroad system. Morgan met with small and medium-sized private owners, persuading, threatening, and bribing where necessary. He took on the strategic leadership, creating infrastructure, planning, and transforming disparate private railroads into one massive, unified network. He convinced railroad owners to work together for the good of the country and for their collective profit. When his father passed away, John Morgan inherited the family bank, combining his assets with his father's. Thus, the giant bank J.P. Morgan and Company was born. The railroad boom also sparked rapid growth in steel production and manufacturing. These conditions created an ever-increasing demand for goods and capital. At the same time, the oil boom began, with railroads becoming the primary means of transporting black gold. Bankrupt railroad companies turned to Morgan for help. He provided them with money, acquired stock, and quickly became the largest railroad magnate. Here's another interesting fact. In 1879, the New York Central Railroad, financed by Morgan, gave an incredible shipping discount to Standard Oil, owned by then little-known businessman John D. Rockefeller. Thanks to this discount, Rockefeller swiftly dominated the oil market, eliminating small competitors and creating an oil giant. In addition to railroads, Morgan profited from manipulating government securities and currency. He bought up large quantities of gold, creating a shortage in the U.S. market. Prices skyrocketed, and once they peaked, Morgan sold the gold, doubling his fortune. Unethical? Yes. Profitable? Absolutely. Morgan accumulated more resources for further expansion, but he needed to secure the trust of the government to ensure that Washington didn't look suspiciously at his rapidly growing influence. Then came the financial crisis of 1895. The U.S. financial system was on the brink of collapse, hundreds of banks were failing, thousands of companies were closing, and chaos ensued. The government tried to save the situation by spending its gold reserves. But the country was down to just $9 million in gold, a catastrophic shortage. The U.S. had no central bank or financial policy, and it urgently needed gold to avoid bankruptcy. This is when Morgan offered a solution: I'll buy gold for you in Europe, and you help me in return. Initially, the government rejected the plan, hoping to sell government bonds to the public to raise money for gold purchases. But bond sales were too slow. Morgan then essentially forced his way into President Grover Cleveland's office and convinced him to accept his plan. The president agreed. The U.S. government bought 3.5 million ounces of gold from Morgan, who, through his connections, sourced it from the Rothschilds, saving the country from default. For this, Morgan receives government bonds and begins to wield significant influence over U.S. policy. The Morgans now control the entire flow of gold into the country. Additionally, Morgan provides the U.S. with another invaluable service. He buys the Panama Canal, which was originally controlled by the French. Morgan raises $1 billion and essentially gifts the government one of the most profitable trade routes in the country. The Panama Canal would remain under U.S. ownership until 1999. By accomplishing these feats, Morgan shields himself from criticism in Washington and gains enormous power. On one hand, he saves his empire; on the other, he saves the country. He genuinely believes that making big money is better and safer in a prosperous homeland, and he is willing to invest in the U.S. This may be the first time he feels responsible for something larger than himself, helping to quell the overwhelming loneliness that had long haunted him. After realizing from the railroad industry that consolidating entire sectors under one control is extremely profitable, Morgan turns his attention to electricity. He orchestrates a series of mergers and acquisitions. For instance, through the merger of Edison General Electric, founded by Thomas Edison, and Thomson Houston Electric Company, he creates the giant known as General Electric. By the late 19th century, railroads, steel, and electricity have become the most lucrative industries. Morgan controls nearly all the railroads and electricity, but steel still remains in the hands of another industrial giant, Andrew Carnegie. By the beginning of the 20th century, Carnegie is ready to retire from business. And then, Morgan shows up on his doorstep. In 1901, Morgan buys Carnegie Steel Company for what would be $12.5 billion in today's money. At the time, this was considered the largest deal in history. Thus, U.S. Steel Corporation was born, the first company in history to achieve a $1 billion turnover, equivalent to nearly $36 billion today. The market capitalization of this one colossal company was estimated to be 17% of the total U.S. economy. With railroads and electricity combined, Morgan effectively controls half of the country's wealth. But Morgan wants even more. And once again, a crisis helps him. In October 1907, panic strikes Wall Street, threatening the U.S. with another collapse. Morgan and Rockefeller lobby for the creation of the Federal Reserve System, the main financial instrument of the U.S. Initially, the government hesitates, and opinions are split nearly evenly. Negotiations drag on for 6 long years. Morgan not only made his mark with major rescues, but also with one of the most notorious disasters in history. He invested in the International Mercantile Marine, which built a ship unlike any other, the Titanic. Morgan himself was supposed to sail on the Titanic's maiden voyage, but he canceled his ticket just a day before the ship set sail. Why? It remains a mystery. On April 14, 1912, the Titanic struck an iceberg and sank. Conspiracy theorists believed that the Titanic's sinking was no accident. On board were several of Morgan's influential opponents who had been blocking the creation of the Federal Reserve System. One way or another, in 1913, the U.S. Congress finally passed the Federal Reserve Act, establishing the Federal Reserve System as the country's main financial authority. It was given the power to print money, and the banks of Morgan and Rockefeller began influencing U.S. economic policy. Even today, 12 of the largest private banks control the Federal Reserve and print U.S. dollars. Among these banks are those representing other influential families, like the Rothschilds, who own 2 of the banks. But the Morgans hold a particularly powerful position among the founders of the Federal Reserve System. John Pierpont Morgan himself didn't live to see his grand plan come to full fruition. He passed away on March 31, 1913, just months before the Federal Reserve's creation. Upon hearing of his death, the U.S. lowered flags to half-mast. The country mourned a man who had saved it from the brink more than once. And though J.P. Morgan died, his legacy lived on. His empire was inherited by his son, John Pierpont Morgan Jr., who would expand and strengthen the dynasty's influence. World War I and World War II brought immense wealth to the Morgans, as the family companies controlled nearly the entire U.S. industrial sector and profited enormously from war contracts. Following his father's footsteps, John Pierpont Morgan Jr. financed both sides of these conflicts. As of 2020, just one of the Morgan family's banks, Morgan Stanley, held assets exceeding $1 trillion. The megabank J.P. Morgan Chase, formed in 2000, controls assets worth $23.5 trillion. Today, the Morgans oversee more than 70 financial, transportation, and industrial companies. They still produce weapons, electricity, steel, and money, and they continue to influence many events shaping the modern world. It's no surprise that J.P. Morgan's likeness became the face of the game Monopoly. According to legend, as the almighty billionaire John Pierpont Morgan lay dying, he uttered just one phrase, "Sally West." No one knew what it meant. Perhaps he was simply delirious? Only later, in his personal archive, a piece of paper was found with a drawing of a small bird and the words Sally West. In his distant childhood, Morgan's father had sent young John to a boarding school in the Azores, and the boy wrote home about how his only friend there was a canary he named Sally West. That bird helped him overcome his loneliness and became his first, and perhaps only, true friend, the one he remembered at the very end of his life. Maybe it's just a touching story invented to humanize a soulless businessman. But who can say? The human soul is a mystery. We can only speculate about the truth. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe, hit the like button, and leave a comment. See you in the next video.